The marble pastry roller is still warm in my hand. My husband's blood smears across the granite as his phone lights up. Is it done? I need her files erased before the reveal. The intruder's body is still bleeding out by the shattered glass doors. I have 30 seconds before Mark walks in, before he sees what I've done and what he's done to me. I swipe the burner phone, my fingers shaking. The ultrasound notification glows on my screen. 2 heartbeats, 1 betrayal. The clock is ticking. The scent of expensive lemon verbena soap and copper filled the kitchen, a nauseating cocktail that made Sarah Miller's stomach churn. She knelt on the cold white floor, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle of a heavy marble pastry roller. It felt like a dead weight in her hand, the stone cold and unforgiving. Just an hour ago, this kitchen had been a sanctuary of architectural precision. Clean lines, subway tiles, and the quiet hum of the high-end refrigerator. Then the glass had shattered. The intruder had come through the patio doors like a shadow made of violence. He hadn't wanted jewelry. He had lunged straight for her laptop on the granite island. Sarah hadn't thought. She had simply reacted, swinging the marble roller with a strength born of pure animal terror. The heavy stone had connected with a sickening thud, sending the masked man backward through the jagged remains of the glass. He hadn't gotten up. Now, the silence of North Raleigh was a physical pressure against her eardrums. She scrubbed at a stubborn dark smear on the granite, the abrasive sponge hissing against the stone. Entry 1413, she thought automatically. Apology for the mess. Apology for the blood. Her hands shook, making the sponge skip. Every second felt like a minute. She had dragged the heavy, limp weight of the man toward the deep pantry, hiding the evidence of the struggle just as the distant rumble of an engine vibrated through the floorboards. Mark was home. She could hear the rhythmic crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, the sound of her husband's arrival, timed to the second, as always. She shoved the bloody towels into the hidden laundry chute and wiped her damp palms on her apron. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the marble island, spotless now, reflecting the recessed lighting from the ceiling. It looked perfect. It looked like a lie. As the garage door groaned open, Sarah's foot brushed against something hard near the base of the island. A small plastic rectangle, the intruder's burner phone. She snatched it up, thrusting it into her pocket just as the door from the garage swung inward. The air from the garage smelled of car exhaust in the damp North Carolina evening. "Sarah, honey, we're home." Mark's voice was a smooth baritone, filled with a warmth that didn't reach his eyes. He stepped into the kitchen, followed closely by Chloe, who was already fluttering her hands and talking about the floral arrangements for the party. Sarah forced a smile, though her face felt like cracking plaster. "Just in time," she managed to say, her voice steady despite the roar of blood in her ears. "I was just tidying up." Mark walked toward her, his movements fluid and confident. He reached out to touch her shoulder, and Sarah fought the urge to flinch. As he leaned in, the light caught a jagged, angry red line running down the side of his neck, a fresh scratch that hadn't been there this morning. The burner phone in Sarah's pocket felt like a live coal, searing through the fabric of her slacks. While Mark and Chloe retreated to the living room to discuss the big reveal, Sarah retreated to the shadows of the hallway. Her fingers fumbled with the cheap plastic device. The screen flickered to life, casting a sickly blue glow on her pale face. There was only one message in the inbox. It had arrived 3 minutes ago. Sarah's breath hitched as she read the words. "Is the job done? I need her files erased before the reveal." The sender's number wasn't saved, but Sarah didn't need a contact name. She knew those digits by heart. It was Mark's private line, the one he used for high-stakes legal consultations. The room seemed to tilt. The man in the pantry hadn't been a random thief. He had been an employee. Mark hadn't just been cheating with Chloe. He was actively trying to delete Sarah's life's work, the blueprints and contracts that defined her firm's legacy. She felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over her. The apology log in her mind ticked over to a new page. She wouldn't be apologizing for this. She slipped into the home office, the room smelling of old books and printer toner. With trembling hands, she connected the burner phone to her laptop. The data transfer bar crawled across the screen, a thin green line that represented her only hope. "Sarah? What are you doing in the dark?" Mark stood in the doorway. The scratch on his neck looked even more prominent in the dim light of the office. He was cracking his knuckles, thumb to pinky, left hand then right, the rhythmic pop, pop, pop echoing in the small room. It was the drumbeat of a lie, just checking a measurement for the Henderson project, Sarah said, her voice dropping into the precise, architectural tone she used for difficult clients. "I didn't want the debt of a mistake to carry over into the weekend. Entry 1414. Mark stepped closer, his eyes scanning the desk. Sarah subtly leaned her body to shield the laptop screen. "You're always so focused on the math, honey. You're getting that spreadsheet look again. Why don't you come out and join us?" Chloe brought the ultrasound photos. "In a minute, Mark. I just need to balance the load-bearing details." She watched him, noting the way he adjusted his cuffs, his eyes never blinking. He was a master of perception. But for the first time, Sarah was looking past the polished facade at the rot beneath. Dinner was a performance of domestic bliss that felt like a slow-motion car crash. They sat in the dining room, the heavy mahogany table reflecting the flickering candlelight. Mark had opened a bottle of expensive Cabernet, the deep red liquid looking uncomfortably like the stains Sarah had just scrubbed off the floor. "We've decided to move the party up," Mark announced, swirling his glass. "Tomorrow morning, a brunch reveal. It's more sophisticated, don't you think, Chloe? Don't you?" Chloe nodded eagerly, her doll-like eyes wide and shimmering. She was clutching a scrap of paper, the list she was always rewriting. "It'll be perfect, Sarah. The light in the garden at 10 a.m. is just divine. It'll make the photos look so ethereal." Sarah picked at her salad, the greens tasting like dust. She could feel the weight of the cloned data on the tablet hidden beneath her napkin. While Mark spun stories about their collective future and the legacy they were building, Sarah was reading the truth in silence. The files from the burner phone were a roadmap of betrayal. Emails to offshore banks, photos of her private passwords, and a series of encrypted messages discussing the incapacity phase. Mark leaned forward, his hand covering hers. "You've been so stressed lately, Sarah. The board has noticed, even I've noticed. Maybe after the party, we should look into a little retreat. Someplace where you don't have to worry about the blueprints." Incapacity, Sarah thought. He's not just stealing the firm. He's telling everyone I'm losing my mind. "I'm fine, Mark," she said, her voice like ice. "I've accounted for the margin of error. The foundation is stronger than you think." Mark's smile didn't falter, but the rhythmic cracking of his knuckles under the table started again. Pop, pop, pop. He knew she was digging. He just didn't know how deep she'd already gone. The house was silent, but it wasn't peaceful. Sarah stood in the darkened home office, the only light coming from her laptop screen. The gender reveal was less than 12 hours away, and the clock was ticking. She had to move. She began the process of transferring her firm's intellectual property, years of CAD drawings, client lists, and patent filings, to a secure offshore server. It was a digital evacuation. But as she clicked Execute, a red box flashed on the screen. Access denied. Administrative override in effect. Her breath caught. She tried again, her fingers flying across the keys. The result was the same. Mark had already locked her out of her own system. He had used the power of attorney she'd signed 6 months ago, the one he'd called a little wooden bridge to the future, to strip her of her own authority. She needed more evidence. She crept into the master bedroom, the air smelling of Mark's expensive cologne and the faint floral scent of Chloe's perfume. Mark was downstairs, finishing the wine. Sarah went straight for his leather briefcase. Inside, tucked behind a stack of standard litigation files, she found a thick manila envelope. Her hands shook as she pulled out the documents. It was a legal petition, already stamped by the county clerk. Petition for involuntary guardianship, the words blurred before her eyes. Mark had filed a claim stating she was suffering from severe work-induced psychosis and erratic, violent behavior. He had cited her apology log as evidence of obsessive-compulsive instability. According to this paper, Sarah Miller no longer had the right to sign a check, enter her office, or even drive her own car. She was a prisoner in a life she had built. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Sarah shoved the papers back into the bag and slipped into the walk-in closet, her heart thundering. Through the crack in the door, she saw the hallway light flicker. The house alarm chirped, a sharp, metallic sound that indicated the back door had been opened. But she had locked it. The house was no longer her castle. It was a trap, and the walls were closing in. Sarah needed to get to her lawyer, David Reynolds. He was a fixer, a man who knew how to navigate the murky waters of North Raleigh's elite. If she could get him the clone data from the burner phone, she might have a chance to stay the guardianship order. She grabbed her keys and slipped into the garage. The air was cold and smelled of bleach, the industrial scent she'd used to cover the intruder's blood. She hit the button for the garage door, but nothing happened. The motor didn't even hum. She climbed into her SUV, her hands gripping the leather steering wheel. She turned the key. The engine coughed and died. She tried again. Nothing. She looked at the dashboard. The tire pressure warning light was glowing a steady, angry orange. She stepped out of the car and looked down. All 4 tires were shredded, the rubber sliced with surgical precision. The garage was silent, save for the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of condensation from the AC unit. Then she heard it. A low, guttural humming. A funeral dirge. A massive shadow stepped out from behind the storage cabinets. It was James Carter, the man Mark had introduced as neighborhood security. He was a wall of muscle, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The jagged scar through his eyebrow made him look like a gargoyle brought to life. "Mr. Miller says you aren't feeling well, Mrs. Miller?" James said, his voice a deep rumble that vibrated in Sarah's chest. "He asked me to make sure you stay inside. For your own safety." "Get out of my way, James," Sarah said, her voice trembling but sharp. "I'm going to my office." The humming grew louder, more insistent. James didn't move. He took a step forward, his shadow swallowing her. "I can't let you do that. Why don't we go back into the kitchen? I'll make some tea." Sarah's hand went to her work bag. Her fingers closed around her heavy steel measuring tape, a professional-grade tool with a weighted metal casing. As James reached for her arm, Sarah swung. The heavy metal case caught him square in the temple with a sickening crack. James grunted, his knees buckling. He didn't fall, but he was stunned, his eyes glazing over. Sarah didn't wait. She bolted past him, ducking under the half-open manual release of the garage door and sprinting into the darkness of the woods. Subverted beat 2.5. The woods were a wall of wet pine needles and jagged granite outcrops. The evening chill bit through Sarah's thin blouse, and the scent of damp earth and rot filled her lungs. She could hear the distant shouts of Mark and James back at the house, their voices stripped of all warmth. They weren't calling for her. They were hunting her. She scrambled behind a massive oak tree, her breath coming in ragged gasps. In her hand, she clutched the heavy nylon bag she had snatched from the garage floor during the struggle, the security guard's bag. She needed a weapon, a phone, anything to give her leverage. "This is smart," she told her racing heart. "He's a professional. He'll have a radio, maybe a map of the property, or a list of Mark's instructions. I can use his own tools against him." Her architectural mind began to build a plan. If she could find a way to contact the outside world, she could expose the guardianship fraud before the party started. She felt a surge of hope. She was Sarah Miller. She solved problems. She optimized spaces. She could optimize this disaster. She fumbled with the heavy nylon zipper. The metal teeth shrieked against the silence of the woods. Her fingers, numbed by the cold, brushed against thick, crisp parchment. She pulled out a single document, the white paper stark against the muddy forest floor. At first, she thought it was a work order, but then she saw the bold lettering at the top. Life Insurance Policy. North Carolina Mutual. She felt a brief moment of relief. Of course, Mark kept the records in the security bag for safekeeping. She turned to the signature page, expecting to see a draft. Her eyes traced the lines. There, at the bottom, was her own signature. A perfect, fluid forgery. Beneath it, Mark's handwriting looped with terrifying precision as the primary beneficiary. The relief vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. She flipped the page. There was a second signature on the witness line. Chloe Thompson. The crack appeared in her mind. She noticed the date on the policy. It wasn't from months ago. It was dated yesterday. And the payout amount wasn't for their mortgage or the firm's debts. It was for $5 million. The truth hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. The guardianship wasn't the end goal. It was the setup. Mark didn't want to just control her. He needed her incapacitated, so that when she had her accident during the hiking trip they had planned for next week, no one would question her state of mind. The intruder in the kitchen hadn't just been there for the files. He had been the first attempt. She wasn't being replaced. She was being liquidated. The documents crinkled in her trembling grip. She realized with a sickening jolt that by running into the woods, she had played right into their hands. A woman suffering a psychotic break, disappearing into the dark forest. It was the perfect narrative for a tragedy. She hadn't found leverage. She had found her own death warrant. The woods didn't feel like a hiding place anymore. They felt like a grave. From the shadows of a dense thicket of mountain laurel, Sarah watched the back of the estate. The house glowed like a lantern in the dark, a masterpiece of glass and stone that she had spent 3 years designing. Now, it looked like a cage. A flashlight beam cut through the trees, sweeping across the clearing. Sarah pressed her back against the rough bark of a pine, her heart hammering. 2 figures emerged onto the stone patio. Mark and Chloe. They weren't shouting anymore. They were standing close together, their silhouettes overlapping. Mark had his arm around Chloe's waist, his hand resting on the small of her back in a way he hadn't touched Sarah in years. She can't have gone far. Chloe's breathy voice drifted on the wind. She's wearing silk flats, Mark. She'll be freezing. It doesn't matter, Mark replied, his voice cold and efficient. The narrative is already set. James told the police she attacked him and fled in a state of extreme agitation. By the time the guests arrive for the reveal tomorrow, everyone will be primed for the news of her breakdown. And the insurance? Chloe asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. The policy's in the bag. Once she's found, the payout settles everything. The shadow debts, the firm's overhead. We start clean. Sarah watched as Mark leaned down and kissed Chloe. Not a quick peck, but a deep, lingering embrace. It was the final confirmation. Every apology she had logged, every meal she had skipped to make him happy, every dollar she had poured into their future had been fuel for this fire. She didn't feel like apologizing anymore. She felt a cold, architectural rage beginning to solidify in her chest. She wasn't a victim to be liquidated. She was the one who knew the structural weaknesses of this entire life. Subverted beat 3.1. The sky opened up, a torrential North Carolina downpour that turned the woods into a slurry of mud and pine needles. Sarah struggled through the deluge, her clothes soaked to the skin, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to reach the Higgins house. Robert Higgins, her neighbor 3 doors down, was a ghost of a man, a retired IT specialist who spent his days counting floor tiles and his nights behind a wall of monitors. He was the only one who could help her bypass Mark's digital wall. She reached his back porch, her hands blue with cold. She pounded on the door. It took minutes, but finally, the light flickered on. Robert opened the door, his eyes darting to the floor. 42, 43, he whispered. Robert, please. Sarah sobbed, the rain streaming down her face. I need help. Mark, he's locked me out. I need to get into the legal portal. Robert hesitated, then stepped aside. He didn't look at her, but he led her to his war room, a garage converted into a high-tech sanctuary. The guest terminal is open, he muttered, returning to his own screens. Sarah slumped into the chair. This was it. Robert's system was a fortress. If she could log into the North Carolina Bar Association's portal from here, she could flag the guardianship petition as fraudulent. She had the cloned data from the burner phone. She had the proof of Mark's affair. This was the smart move, the legal, logical path to safety. She felt a flicker of hope. The system would protect her once it saw the truth. She typed in her credentials. Her hands were steady now. The screen glowed white, then gold. Access granted. She navigated to the emergency injunction page. She just needed to upload the burner phone logs and the insurance policy scan. I've got you, Mark, she whispered. But as the upload bar reached 90%, the screen suddenly flickered and turned a bruised purple. A new window popped up, overriding the portal. It was a live video feed. Sarah froze. The camera was high angle, looking down into a sterile, white room. In the center of the room sat a woman Sarah didn't recognize, but the man standing next to her was unmistakable. It was David Reynolds. Her lawyer, her fixer. Phase 1 is complete, David said into a phone, his voice echoing through Robert's speakers. The incapacity papers were processed an hour ago. The court has already appointed Mark as the sole conservator. Anything Sarah tries to upload now will be flagged as the delusional ramblings of a compromised mind. The crack in Sarah's hope was a physical sensation, like a rib snapping. She looked at the date on the video feed. It was a recording from earlier that afternoon. David Reynolds continued, "And Robert? Make sure the guest terminal tracks her location. We need to know exactly where she is when the breakdown happens." Sarah turned slowly toward Robert. The old man wasn't counting anymore. He was staring at his screen, his face pale. He wasn't her ally. He was another piece of Mark's architecture. Mark hadn't just forged a few papers. He had bought the very people Sarah trusted to protect her. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Robert whispered, finally looking her in the eye. "He said you were sick. He said you'd try to hurt yourself. He paid my mortgage for the next 10 years. The full collapse hit her. By logging into the portal from here, she hadn't saved herself. She had pinged her exact GPS coordinates to Mark's security team. She was in a worse position than before. She wasn't just a woman in the woods. She was a legally incapacitated fugitive whose every move was being tracked by the very man she thought was helping her. The legal system hadn't just failed her. It had been weaponized to erase her existence. The headlights of a black SUV cut through the rain, sweeping across Robert's driveway. Sarah didn't wait for Robert to call out. She vaulted over the porch railing, her feet hitting the mud with a wet thud. She didn't head back to the woods. She ran toward the drainage ditch that lined the edge of the neighborhood. She dove into the freezing, waist-deep water just as the SUV slowed. Through the tall grass, she saw the silhouette of Mark and Chloe in the front seats. They were patrolling the streets like hunters. "She's close." Mark's voice was amplified by the car's open window. Robert said she just left. Sarah held her breath, the muddy water stinging her eyes. The scent of brine and motor oil was overwhelming. She watched the red taillights of the SUV fade into the curtain of rain. She couldn't go home. She couldn't go to the police, not with David Reynolds and Mark controlling the narrative. There was only one place left where the elite of North Raleigh gathered, a place where the reveal was scheduled to happen. The country club. She pulled herself out of the ditch, her body shaking with cold. She began to walk, her silk flats long gone, her bare feet bleeding on the gravel. She knew the layout of the club better than anyone. She had designed the new West Wing. She knew the service entrances, the ventilation shafts, and the blind spots in the security cameras. If they wanted a show, she would give them one. The country club was a fortress of dark mahogany and oppressive silence. Sarah slipped through the side service entrance, the smell of rotting grease from the kitchen traps hitting her like a physical blow. She moved through the shadows of the basement, her internal map guiding her past the buzzing transformers and hissing steam vents. She reached the women's locker room, a place of stale cedar and forgotten sweat. She needed a phone, a way to reach the AV booth. She fumbled through the lockers, her fingers searching for a discarded device. Looking for this? Sarah spun around. Chloe stood by the vanity, her doll-like eyes narrowed. She wasn't wearing her innocent friend mask anymore. In her hand, she held a heavy gold golf trophy, the metal gleaming in the dim light. "You should have stayed in the woods, Sarah," Chloe said, her voice dropping the breathy lilt. "It would have been so much cleaner. Now, we have to do this the hard way." Chloe lunged, swinging the trophy with a jagged, desperate energy. Sarah ducked, the heavy gold whistling past her ear and smashing into a wooden locker with a splintering crash. They grappled on the slick tile, the air thick with the smell of Chloe's expensive perfume and Sarah's sweat. Chloe was stronger than she looked, her fingers clawing at Sarah's face. "He never loved you," Chloe hissed. "You were just a line item in his budget." Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline. She grabbed Chloe's wrist, twisting it with the precision of a structural engineer finding a weak point. The trophy clattered to the floor. Sarah shoved Chloe backward, her head striking the edge of a marble bench. Chloe slumped, dazed. Sarah didn't hesitate. She dragged the dazed woman toward the reinforced equipment storage closet at the back of the room. She shoved her inside and slammed the heavy oak door, sliding the brass bolt into place. Chloe began to scream, her fists pounding against the wood, but the locker room was soundproofed. Sarah leaned against the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked down at Chloe's abandoned designer handbag on the vanity. She dumped the contents out. Amidst the lipsticks and the mother's list, she found a slim blue folder. She opened it, expecting more insurance papers. Instead, she found a medical contract from a clinic in South Carolina. Surrogacy agreement. Donor ID, SM-1412. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She flipped to the back. There was a consenting donor form. It bore her signature, another perfect forgery. The realization was a knockout blow. Chloe wasn't actually pregnant. They were using a surrogate, and they had used Sarah's harvested eggs, taken during her minor gallbladder surgery last year, to create the child. Mark didn't just want her money. He wanted her biological legacy. By making her the consenting donor, he had legally tied her entire estate to a child that would be raised by him and Chloe. Even if Sarah survived, she would be financially shackled to them for the next 18 years. She was trapped legally, financially, and biologically. The ballroom upstairs was filling with the sounds of laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. The gender reveal was about to begin. Sarah moved through the service vents, the dust coating her lungs, the high-pitched whine of electronic interference growing louder as she approached the AV booth. She could see the guests through the slats in the vents. The elite of Raleigh, dressed in their finest, waiting for the miracle to be revealed. She reached the booth and slipped inside. The room was dark, filled with glowing monitors showing every corner of the club. On the main screen, a digital rendering of a nursery was playing, a soft, blue and pink animation designed to tug at the heartstrings. Sarah's fingers flew across the control board. She didn't need a password. She had designed the system's interface. She bypassed the nursery animation and plugged in her tablet. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mark's voice boomed over the speakers in the ballroom. He was standing on the stage, looking every bit the doting husband. "We've been through a lot this year. My dear Sarah is resting. But she wanted me to share this moment with all of you." He hit the play button on his remote. But instead of a nursery, the giant screens in the ballroom flashed to a grainy, night vision recording. It was the footage from the burner phone. Mark's face, clear and unmistakable, as he handed a stack of cash to the intruder in their kitchen. "Make sure the files are gone." Mark's voice echoed through the ballroom, stripped of its warmth. "And if she's in the way, make it look like she fell." The ballroom went silent. The only sound was the heavy, metallic thud of the grandfather clock in the lobby. Sarah hit the next command. The surrogate contract and the forged insurance policy scrolled across the screen, the signatures highlighted in bright red. Mark froze on stage, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He looked toward the AV booth, his eyes wide with a terror he couldn't hide. Sarah stepped out onto the ballroom gallery, looking down at the wreckage of her life. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The architecture of his lies had collapsed, and the weight of it was crushing him. The police arrived as the first guests began to flee the ballroom. David Reynolds was the first to be let out in handcuffs, his fixer smile replaced by a mask of silent fury. Mark was found in the hallway, trying to reach the parking lot. When the officers tackled him, he began to scream about perception and legacy. But the sound was drowned out by the clicking of handcuffs. In the locker room, they found Chloe. As she was let out, her dress caught on the doorframe, and the prosthetic pregnancy belly she had been wearing shifted, then fell to the floor. A hollow, silicone lie. Sarah watched it all from the shadows of the lobby. She felt a strange, hollow peace. The apology log in her mind was empty. There were no more debts to settle. She walked back to her house one last time. The marble island was still spotless, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary. She packed a single bag, her blueprints, her laptop, and a few clothes. As she walked out the front door, she paused at the brass eagle knocker. She didn't polish it. She didn't check the alignment. She just closed the door and walked away. Charleston smelled of salt air and decaying marsh grass. A heavy, honest scent that didn't try to hide anything. Sarah sat on the porch of her small, sun-drenched cottage, watching the tide pull away from the shore. The divorce had been surgical. With the evidence of the fraud and attempted murder, she had taken everything: the firm, the house, the accounts. Mark and Chloe were facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary. She picked up her phone. She looked at the apology log app. She hesitated for a moment, then hit delete. The silence of the porch wasn't a threat anymore. It was a luxury. She leaned back in her chair, the warmth of the South Carolina sun on her face. For the first time in 32 years, she wasn't optimizing a space for someone else. She was just living in her own. The foundation was finally solid. And this time, she was the only one with the keys.